One of the greatest academic scholar, Harvey 2001, wrote an academic article in which we can learn from. On page 103 to page 104, there's something in which we can quote from. He said, through their daily struggles as well as activities, individuals as well as various social groups create a social world of a city. And that in doing so, they do quite a number of things where they create something that is very uncommon, which is a framework in which we can all dwell in. That is a framework where you include excessive abuse, but also, while this is culturally uncommon, it can also be destroyed through various uses. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Street Vending.
Welcome back to another episode of Unclaimed, a podcast where we explore the silent, invisible, and sometimes uncomfortable negotiations in informal economies. I'm Kazulomiyane,
and my name is Asli Benoashe. Now, in our last episode, right, we covered a very powerful object, right? One that is really powerful in helping one understand the psychology of the mind firstly, and also how people without shelter navigate a city that was never designed for them.
Yeah.
Right? It was also an object that was really changed the game for us in terms of viewing the silent transactions of trading and navigating places in informal economies. And that was homelessness. It was an episode that was built on a conversation in which we had with the football and acquaintances, right? Where they literally gave us a fresh perspective of not looking at homelessness as just sleeping outside, but rather camping outside. I think that was quite powerful.
Yeah. And also not just sleeping outside, but also looking at it as if like them from their own community.
Yes.
Because it was a community episode there, rather than us looking for those silent transactions that happens because you want like a particular space near that.
Yeah,
Definitely, and stuff like that.
Yes, and I also think on the same urban landscape, we'll be looking at something similar, which is the street.
Yeah, the street, but specifically street vending, where as people we often overlook street vending as a separate hassle, but it is deeply political, right?
Yeah.
So these vendors often our mama selling amagwinya or our baba pushing those carts, they're actually trying to make a living.
Yeah,
and we're trying to look at those silent transactions that happen within them. Not necessarily within them, but between us people as we buy and them as they sell.
On a daily basis, African cities, we see quite a lot of vending sites, such as nightstands,
door-to-door selling, the carpet, all those things that we normally see when we actually go into actual spaces.
Yeah.
However, these things were already there. I'm not saying that they were not there. They were already there, but then they started taking over after COVID-19 because most people, the restriction of you not selling whatsoever due to COVID.
Yeah.
People started doing the door-to-door selling,
Yes.
the carpet, just as a way to survive.
Yeah.
However, corruption.
Yeah. Silence. That's where the silence comes in. Yeah.
Yes, it's because we have the policemen trying to stop us and whatsoever.
Yeah.
Because of money.
It's
One is
monetary.
trying to actually continue selling this stuff and whatsoever. So normally policemen, based on the reading that we did,
Yeah.
they take bribes that actually allow people to continue selling their stuff. However, this is also bad because imagine you selling to me but also buying from me.
That is very true. And also, the crazy part about it is how can you be still buying from me from a trader perspective and still want monetary means for me to keep just literally trading in that space?
Yeah.
And that's very absurd if you ask me, and quite twisted when you think about there are state regulations that come into play, but there's also harassment of women.
That's true.
Hence you find that in street vending a lot of women actually trade in small corners where they are often unseen, similar to homelessness. Yes, which is quite really it's quite something. And also definitely a combination of recession or repression and tolerance, which is instilled by firstly municipal officials and also politicians, whilst still trying to maintain the whole image of just creating a modern city. That's quite ironic if you ask me, especially when you're thinking about just the principle. It's always about the principle of doing things more than it is just the practice, but the principle is very important. And that homelessness, street vending is in the public eye, is also contested. As we was said in our last episode, the streets are quite cold. They are quite cold.
Yeah.
But also, one of the readings that we did by Gia, right, she reminded us that before the urban flood, the streets are not just cold for them, right, but it's a very important resource for sustaining livelihoods, right? And also, it is a site of economic survival, like we mentioned earlier, for putting food on the table for those who do not have access to formal economy and formal employment opportunities, which is something that we are currently facing. We have a high unemployment rate.
That's true.
Yeah, and street vending for most, like we saw in Botswana, where because of the high unemployment rate, they resorted to street vending.
And we are talking about not necessarily Botswana, but about unemployment. There's this trend that's currently going where people can show what their degree is and whatever they graduated in and whatever, and then the card job they actually do it.
Yeah.
Most of the time, street vending, people selling on the street, or people actually have their small stalls selling food, trying to make a living because
it's a tough economy. It's a really tough economy. And also, like the sidewalk in such spaces, as when these traders trade in, it isn't some neutral piece of land, right? They are all negotiated. They have unique codes where they need to run away from the police. There's quite a lot that they never get through, right? And also they claim the unclaimed. Yeah. They set up shop and negotiate their way in every inch of that particular pavement. Which is quite ironic.
Yeah, I totally that because these spaces are constituted by the local specific interaction among and between the human and non-human actors.
Yeah.
So the non-human actors are not just captured by the trade commodities, the logistics, the marketplaces, and the physical vending sites, but also they include the urban planning mobilities.
That's very true.
And the multiple organizational and spatial overlays. So the brief to those that are know,
I use these stereotypes a lot,
you will call this street geography. A term that captures spaces or captures how spaces are lived, contested, and sometimes refined. And then based on this, we look at the other cases that actually lead to people, not necessarily lead to people selling on streets, but that's the push factor. It's the COVID-19 and the 2013 Operation Clean Sweep. That was quite a tough one. Yeah.
And I mean, when we think about just how these have intensified, right?
Yeah.
We need to think about the tactics that people actually use for survival in these streets, especially when it comes to the silent ways, and also when you're looking at it from a gendered perspective. And there's no playbook, but these are the tactics. So the first one is infiltration and corruption. Paying off officials and to hold the spot is something that they do.
Yeah, so with the paying officials to hold their post, it's something else because how many officials would you pay to actually get that space? Because what if one person comes in and you pay that particular person, another one comes in and you have to pay that person? That's crazy. You're losing a lot of money at the end of the day, whereas you're trying to make a living.
That's very true. And also that's where corruption comes in. And I think we touched on a lot of corruption when we were looking at our seminars as well.
It's not only what they say, it's corruption. Some people call it political connection.
Yeah. So it's about the terming.
Yeah, it's about the terming. Apparently it's different, whereas we see it
we
as
see it quite
differently.
differently. Definitely. And also another aspect that street vendors use to actually survive the streets is civil disobedience. What they do in order to be able to, that's what municipal officials see it as, civil disobedience. So in order to counteract this, they also set up shop again the day after evictions, which is a form of resilience because when you are trying to get me out of the street.
That's true.
Yeah,
that's true.
There's not a lot of employment opportunities. I'm just trying to feed my kids.
Part.
Yeah, and also that's also another aspect that links to nomadic maneuvering of streets, right? And what they do is they arrive at dawn and disappearing by noon. I feel like there is another survival instinct in which I am forgetting.
You're forgetting the strategies.
Yeah.
You're forgetting
The strategies.
The way they get so evicted, they ended up having strategies to actually, post eviction strategies to use after your housing, actually your store has been demolished and whatsoever.
True.
What they do in Kisimu, Kibuya market, we build their stores overnight.
Yeah.
And what they also do is they do this thing of striking and actually
Chanting,
chanting,
yeah.
the street is ours.
Valid,
You get
valid,
me?
yeah.
So when they do that, it's as if like they're reclaiming the space as theirs.
Yeah.
Right? Because the street is for everyone, it's for everyone to
Very
use.
true, yeah.
Right? However, even when vendors actually, on another aspect is that even those vendors who are licensed, sometimes they are silenced. Because
very true.
they will also can be evicted even though you're silenced to actually have a stall or whatsoever within the road. Right? So they're still vulnerable. Yes, they pay rent, they follow the rules and do whatsoever, but they're still vulnerable in the streets.
That's very true. And I feel like a lot of them also still face harassment.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also,
Especially women.
yeah.
Because they tend to say we're powerless.
That's very true.
Do you remember when we went for the interviews for the street vending?
Oh,
We
yes.
were offered marriage proposals.
Yes. That's
So
actually
imagine a woman selling every day and then being offered that.
to just survive the streets.
You just survive
Or
the
paying
streets.
someone to be your husband in the
Imagine.
streets. That's quite very true. It's quite twisted.
It's quite twisted.
Yeah, and I think something heavy that we need to sit on is gender vulnerability. Especially gender vulnerability is quite a big thing. Female vendors face all the same structural barriers, yeah, but with added layers of harassment, extortion, even sexual violence.
That's
They are
true.
not even just paying to work, right? But they also need to feel safe within these spaces. And still, we don't talk about such things.
We don't talk about such because we're so afraid of exposing such things.
That is very
And
true.
these things they happen each and every day and we see them.
And I feel like it's an open secret in the streets that women need to pay to be protected.
To be protected.
Yes. Or share that.
Let's not be like that. Let's also include men because there are some men who are actually vulnerable to that.
That's very true. And I think also when we're reflecting back on the aspect of COVID-19, right? I think COVID-19 just really worsened this. It was suddenly the street presence was illegal and bribes increased, right? And also something that we must ask ourselves, how much of the money that female traders actually make goes to just having someone to protect them or having a husband to protect them? Because if we think about it, when we look at the inner city in a nutshell, without the street vendors, that wouldn't make the inner city that it is today.
Yes, because remember, they've been saying that the inner city is dying. But
Yes.
it's currently this life because of the street vendors, because of
Yes.
what's currently happening there.
Yeah. So yes, it's experiencing a physical death in terms of urban decay and all these other attributes, but there is so much liveliness in informal microeconomy.
That's true.
Yeah, and also yet planning laws, right, and modernist city visions are ones that are always trying to erase them from the city. And I think also this links back to our research where we are low-key fighting for them to acknowledge such informal economies because it's something that happens, and in order for us to be able to build better, more creative, more versatile cities, we need to acknowledge the existence.
We need to acknowledge but the thing is, as planners, we're not taught all of this. We're taught to formalize. And
That's
sometimes
true.
that's not the way. We've been saying this thing of formalizing.
Yeah.
As planners, we shouldn't formalize. We are not taught. We don't really know what we expect when you go to the real world. Yes, currently that's what we have to do. We have to plan the smart cities or whatsoever.
Yeah.
We continue to actually marginalize these people based on what we do, what we plan, because we don't really consider them when we're planning.
That's very
So,
true.
what we need is actually a radical rethinking of urban governance.
True.
Vendors aren't the problem, they're just part of the solution that we don't really have currently. And as planners, we have to look at such.
Yeah.
Right? We have to actually recognize them in legal frameworks.
Most definitely,
You
yes.
you get me? Because, yes, there are frameworks that recognize the marginalized, but they don't really recognize what's happening on the spaces. These open spaces that they use to actually sell or whatever.
Yeah.
Right? So we need to have policies that do that. Inclusive policies, right?
You need
so,
those, yes.
Same thing with inclusive policies. We have to do the same thing as legalizing certain things,
Yes,
right?
definitely.
And then we need to have urban design work that doesn't only work for people that are rich, or I wouldn't even say rich. Sometimes middle class or whatsoever, but work within those spaces, the informal economies, right? Yes, there are some projects where they actually build those temporary stalls and whatsoever to actually accommodate street vendors and whatsoever. But then we should acknowledge that even this pavement that we actually used to work in should be used as other things, as they are used right now. Instead of
repurposed.
Repurposed. Instead of us saying that people should actually move and whatsoever, or having those signs. Normally in geography, those signs where if street trading in certain points is restricted.
Yeah.
So having such things, it restricts people from actually doing the work. You get me? So realizing such things and recognizing such things will actually help.
Most definitely. And I think one of the most important attributes is just a shift in perception, right? Especially the public's perception. Vendors can't always be playing Tom and Jerry.
That's true. You remember that feeding?
Yes.
Was it a Zimbabwean one?
It was.
They're like, they actually play
Tom and Jerry is basically cat and mouse. With municipal officials. The vendor to corner is like it needs to be nuanced, right? And also she's an innovator, right? Which is basically when we think about women in street vending as the whole. She's an innovator, an entrepreneur, and a mother, and a survivor.
A survivor.
Yes. Yeah, she's a survivor. So the next time when you pass a street vendor, alright, don't just walk by her. Like, just understand how they claim the space.
Can I say something? But So this is what we're about as the Unclaimed. Me and her,
Unclaimed.
It's about us actually kind of trying to find that quiet power of the informal and the invisible and the resilient.
And well, ladies and gentlemen, on that note, thank you so much for joining us for this particular episode. In our next episode, we're going to be looking at very intensified aspect or facet of informality, and that is informal land occupation, where we look at how informal dwellers fight for their dignity, for space and justice in the cities that continues to exclude them.
And that's it from us,
The Unclaimed.